the workshop is going to be recorded just for students to be able to access it later on, because as we all know, we're in a pandemic and we all have very intense schedules and everyone's kind of like in different time zones and whatnot. So we definitely want these workshops to be available as a resource. That being said, if anyone is not comfortable with this being recorded, or if you don't want to be in the recording for whatever reason, just definitely feel free to send us a private message or an email, and we will find other accommodations for students who can't be here. So this is a workshop on Intro to Fermentation with Naughty Nettle Medicinals. So without further ado, I will let you go ahead and take it away.
All right, thank you very much, Nicole. Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Yes, thanks for that nice introduction there. My name is Mark Reynolds. I am Naughty Nettle Medicinals, and today we are going to be talking about fermentation, going from the very kind of introductory steps to fermentation to maybe some more advanced techniques as well. So for today, how it's going to look, we've got like the next, I expect us to go for like the next hour and a half or so if we get us in a lot of nice questions. And I'm going to start with introducing myself, doing my land acknowledgements. Then we're going to talk about fermentation as a topic in general. What is it? Where do we find it? How do we do it? Then I'm going to talk you through some very simple introductions to fermentation, and then we're going to get into some more complex things, and then we're going to finish up with some questions at the end of it. So for those who are here on Zoom with me at the moment, feel free to write in the chat if you have any questions, or raise your hand as well. I can see you all here on my screen to my left. And there's no such thing as a silly question or a stupid question. This is how we learn. I have certainly made a lot of mistakes in the past, and I am here as a resource for you folks, so please put me to good use. Now, with that being said, before we go any further, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. So I am here in Montreal in the traditional land and waters of the Kanien'kehá:ka people and other nations of First Island. It's important to acknowledge that this land was once somebody else's and to make steps to become more together as different peoples in this land that we find ourselves on. Not only is it the land I'd like to acknowledge, but certainly the knowledge itself. Like for myself, I work as a wild forager, an educator, and a herbalist. So a lot of my resources, thanks to something as beautiful as the internet, comes from many different cultures and many different backgrounds. So some of the knowledge I'll be sharing with you today comes from different cultures all around the world. I spent a good 4 years living in Asia, eating a lot of nice fermented food as well. So it's not just from my own culture that I am sharing the knowledge that I have learned here this afternoon. And the last acknowledgement is a little bit of gratitude towards the plants. If we didn't have those, we wouldn't have the air we breathe, the food we eat, the clothes we wear, to name a few. So always a little bit of gratitude helps set the right kind of tone for the workshops. Now, I have a question for the few of us who are here in the chat. Let's get on to fermentation. So my questions to you are, has anyone here ever tried doing a ferment of their own before? And if anyone can name some fermented foods. Just curious what folks know about what is fermented or not already. I'll give you a few moments here. Kimchi, perfect. Okay, so this is kimchi, for those who don't know. It is a South Korean dish. I spent a good 2.5 years in South Korea eating. They have 80 different kinds of kimchi over there, depending on where you are in the country. So kimchi is essentially a sauerkraut with a bunch of different spices. We also have miso, sauerkraut, kimchi, kombucha, sourdough, very good. Okay, natto, yes, great. Okay, so this is pretty interesting. So there's kind of two kinds of fermented foods. There's foods that are probiotic. That means that they are still alive, they are still living. And all of the ones that people have named here, miso, kimchi, sauerkraut, kombucha, these are living. So when we drink or eat them, we are getting beneficial bacteria that's good for our gut health. Now, the other side of it is there are also fermented foods that are no longer living, but they've kind of gone through the process of fermentation, and we have an end result. For those who don't know, some things might be bread. Right? Bread is fermented, the yeast makes it rise, and then it's cooked, and all of the yeast inside dies, and we basically eat the corpses of the yeast and bacteria in, with some delicious butter on top or whatever we might like. Tea is fermented. This is the difference between green tea which is not fermented, and black tea which is fermented. Chocolate. The cacao beans themselves, they come out in like a white milky fruit. This is often laid up in piles, and then it's left to ferment for a few days as the fruit breaks down, and then the flavor of the cacao bean changes, and then it's roasted and turned into chocolate. Some other kind of more common fermented things that we have in our fridge at home, or cheeses are fermented. Maybe not the stuff that comes out of a spray can, I'm not too sure about that, but all yogurt as well is generally probiotic, still alive, and very tasty and good for you too. Let me see if I can think of any other. Beer, wine, cider, all of those good things are fermented, and generally what happens is they're no longer living because the level, so we start off with a lot of sugars. Let's say you take grape juice. It's very sugary, it's very sweet. As the bacteria starts to eat the sugars, the alcohol rises, and then it gets to a certain point where the alcohol kills the yeast and there's no more activity, and we've just got the booze left that we all know and love. So fermented food is generally a lot more around us than we think. And I will just explain a little bit about what is fermentation, and then I'll talk about how we've kind of lost a lot of fermented foods, and then we're going to get into how to rediscover them for ourselves. So, fermentation. I have here something on this cabbage. So I'm going to go to my close-up camera here. Where might I find that? Here it is. So, boop. Everyone hopefully can see this now. And I have here just a nice purple cabbage. And I wonder if you've ever been to the supermarket and you can see, let's see here. Yeah, this is a nice angle. So right here, there is kind of like there's a darker side and a lighter side. Now, I wonder if anyone can tell me what is this, and I can kind of wipe this away with my finger too. You've probably seen this on many different fruits and vegetables, plums, pears, apples, blueberries. And this, for those who don't know, is the Lactobacillus bacteria. So on the surface of this cabbage, there is a bacteria known as Lactobacillus, and this is the primary agent that does the fermentation. So Lactobacillus bacteria, what it does is it takes starches and sugars that are in this cabbage, let's say, and it ferments them into different acids and proteins and breaks them down. Essentially, we are kind of cooking our food when we ferment it. The acid helps break down the nutrients, deconstruct the cell walls that are in the plant so it becomes softer, easier for us to digest, and easier for our bodies to access the nutrients inside. Now, if I was just to let this rot in a field, it would probably start to ferment on the inside, but it wouldn't necessarily be very tasty for us. If anyone's ever walked through an apple orchard at the end of the season and you've seen all of the apples laying around on a field, you can kind of smell this alcoholic odor in the air, and that is all the yeasts that live around the peel of the apple have started eating those rotting apples and turning them into cider. So fermentation is an extremely natural process. It is part of the life cycle of this plant, and we can harvest it for our own benefits. So that is how fermentation works. It's the acids that break down and cook our food into more nutritious substances. Now, fermentation used to be one of our primary ways of preserving food. I have here a sauerkraut that I made earlier. It's a nice, beautiful red cabbage. And I actually made this one in December, I believe. And it's been sat in my fridge and I've slowly been eating it. And what are we now? Middle of March. So this is 3.5 months old right here. Now, how is it that you can turn this cabbage, which may last a month or two in the fridge before it starts going bad, into something that can last? I've literally had, I remember I've eaten kimchi that's over 2 years in age before, and there's probably some other weird and wonderful ferments out there that have gone for a lot longer than that. So essentially the Lactobacillus bacteria creates an acidic environment. The pH of this will be around 2.5 to 3.5. So it's a pretty acidic solution. I think it's acidic, yep. And by doing that, there's also salt water in here that helps prevent bacteria, and then the acidity also prevents bacteria. So we get a very shelf-stable product. Great for keeping your food good for a long time. That's one of the benefits of fermenting. Now, some other benefits of fermenting. Everyone knows about pickles, right? You take a cucumber, you put it into vinegar, and it turns into a pickle. Now, pickles there's also a way to ferment them, which I'll talk about in a second. But by basically pickling our food or fermenting our food, we are making them more nutritious. There's more vitamin C in a pickle than there is in your lemons or oranges. Your common garden cucumber, fresh from the garden, doesn't have much vitamin C in it, if any at all. However, once it's pickled, you end up with something much richer and much more nutritious. So the act of fermentation makes our food more nutritious. Now, pickles are a very interesting one because essentially, as our society here in Canada, and myself, I'm British as well, so back in Europe, as we got more and more industrialized, we have kind of seen a decline in the number of fermented foods that we eat, and also the number of gut bacteria, like different species of gut bacteria that live within us. So here's something you may not know, that essentially anything that is today made and pickled in vinegar, like pickled like gherkins, like your pickles, your traditional pickles, were originally fermented once upon a time. And I'm going to talk you through how to ferment and make your own pickles later on as well. The idea being that vinegar is a much more shelf-stable and easier process. You just basically take vinegar, throw in your cucumbers and walk away. Whereas to ferment them, it's a little bit trickier. However, we do get more benefits, I find, from the probiotic nature of the food, because vinegar it's a non-living thing that we're using at that point. So some other common fermented condiments that are no longer fermented anymore: tomato ketchup, your traditional Heinz was originally a fermented product. You can ferment tomatoes in a salt brine, and then you can blend them up and you can make yourself a nice tomato ketchup. Mustard, I've actually made quite a few different mustards using live ferments, and these are traditionally, like everyone knows the sour tang of mustard. It's because it was originally fermented once upon a time, but today we just use your common white vinegar and mustard seeds and put the two together. So there's a lot that we've lost in terms of what used to be fermented in our regular diets and the benefits of fermented foods. So I already mentioned one of them: shelf life. Things that are fermented stay good for a lot longer. Second, we're talking about the probiotic nature. So our gut biome, which lives mostly in our large intestine, has anywhere between 1,500 to 3,000 different species of bacteria living within it. And we are finding more and more and more that this is kind of the basis, the foundation of good health, is to look after your gut biome. And the way that we look after it is by eating probiotic foods. We get to add these different species back into our gut. They found, like I heard a really interesting study that was saying that patients who lived through traumatic episodes in their lifetime and are kind of dealing with trauma in a therapeutic setting have fewer species of gut bacteria alive in their biome. And whether that's because the stresses of life cause the bacteria within us to die off, or maybe the coping mechanisms are harmful to gut health. Think of alcohol or drugs, for example. It didn't go into too much information, but essentially the gut, like, let's think of this, the serotonin, the happiness hormone, 95% of it is made in the large intestine. It's like where your happiness comes from. A lot of people think it's the brain, but it's really the gut which helps produce the serotonin that gets released around our bodies and makes us feel good. So by looking after our ferments and looking after ourselves, we are essentially growing our own, I don't want to say antidepressants, but maybe look at a little bit of a mood booster, and most certainly an immune booster. My parents have gotten the fermentation bug from me, and my mum is frantically making different kinds of sauerkraut back in England. And she told me that apparently the UK government has recommended as something against the current pandemic to eat your sauerkraut, which is quite a new thing for the government to say. But anyone who's kind of looked into coronaviruses or the cold and flu, like a good cold and flu remedy is to eat a tablespoon of sauerkraut 2 or 3 times a day the moment that you start to feel sick, to help bring your immune system back online. So there's some good benefits for why we should include fermented foods in our diet. So now I'm going to talk for some like really beginner steps to fermentation. I'm going to talk about the idea of soaking your grains and your nuts. So right here in front of me, I have some good old-fashioned porridge oats, your flocons de l'avoine in French, or your quick instant oats here. So oats are a staple. They've been a staple for thousands of years all around the world, although for one reason or another, we have kind of lost the way to prepare these. So I'm going to take you, I got some sunflower seeds here as well. Now, I'm just going to take a moment here to explain the life cycle of a seed. So this seed here, it's quite tasty, it's quite nutritious. Now, what happens with this seed here is a animal will come along once this plant is ready, and it will be it'll start munching on the sunflowers, whether this is a squirrel, a bird, or some other larger animal. It'll be eaten, it'll be pooped out, and the idea is that eventually this will grow into a plant. And the kind of the mechanisms that allow that to happen are every seed that we have, or every nut, there's very little difference between the two, that we have in our diet today, has mechanisms in them that protect them from being digested. Without getting I won't get too graphic about how you can find that out for yourself, but you know, if you look in your toilet bowl after eating some corn, you might be able to understand what I'm talking about here. The idea being that the plant wants to prevent itself from being digested so that it can then grow and turn into a beautiful plant after it's been eaten by an animal. Now, the idea is that there are different acids, mostly phytic acids, botanic acids, as well as some others in there that prevent them from being digested so that they're able to grow afterwards. A good example of this is to think of walnuts. If anyone's ever eaten what I call a raw walnut, just a fresh one out of the bag, you'll kind of notice how if you eat a handful of them, your mouth kind of feels a little bit puckered, a little bit dry, a little bit bitter. It's because there's a lot of tannic acid in walnuts. And essentially what we're doing when we eat raw nuts, we are, these acids bind with minerals as they go through our digestive system, and they are actually depleting our body of minerals. Like, say, for example, if I was to drink a glass of milk and eat a handful of walnuts, I'm going to absorb less calcium than if I just drank a glass of milk because of the tannic acids that are in there. So how do we prevent this from happening? Really, really simple. And for those who are big fans of oatmeal, you can thank me later because you'll be able to make one of the best bowls of oatmeal that you've had maybe in your entire life, is to essentially soak this in water the night before you want to eat it. Don't have to, like, the same amount of water that you would cook with normally. Put it in there, add a pinch of salt. Salt is it does two things here. It prevents other bacteria from growing, as well as activating the enzyme activity that exists already in the oats. So we soak it in water, we add a pinch of salt, we leave it overnight, and then we cook it in the morning. We just heat it up. You can soak it in the same pan, put it straight onto the heat, and eat it that way. And what we're doing then is we're ensuring that all of those acids that are in there protecting the oats are then released and as they're being soaked, and we are then able to digest it and eat it a lot faster and a lot more accessible to our bodies. So this is essentially the simplest kind of fermentation you can do. It's just a one night thing, and I'm actually going to soak some of these seeds here now. I'll take this wide one here. And there's kind of a part two to this, which I will get into later, but I'm just going to simply put in some sunflower seeds. And honestly, the best one to try, if you don't believe me, like you're like, what's he talking about? Soaking his nuts, like this guy's pretty weird. Try it out with walnuts. All you have to do, soak them, generally like minimum is 6 hours. Overnight is perfectly fine. You can't really go wrong if you just leave it for 12 hours or so. And if you still like crunchy nuts, then you drain them and you can put them in the oven, or you can put them in a dehydrator and they'll get nice and crispy. If you put them in the oven, be sure to turn them like 2 or 3 times, otherwise they'll stick to the pan and just kind of melt and burn. And then you will have a soft, buttery nut that has none of that astringency, none of those acids left in there, and it really is a completely different food. So do we drain that water or use it to cook the oats? You can use the water to cook your oats. You don't have to drain it whatsoever. Like the idea is that the acids come out, they bind with what's in the water, and then when we cook it, it's like inert, it's done, and we can get to enjoy that all there. So I've got my sunflower seeds here that I'm going to leave to soak, and sunflower seeds are quite easy. I drain them out, and you can even just toast them in a pan when they're still wet, and they're quite tasty that way. And I'm going to come back to this later on because we're going to do, oh yeah, I should probably add a pinch of salt here. Just don't forget, just a pinch of salt. And we're going to come back to this later on as kind of a second stage for this little recipe here. I had a workshop planned last year. It was called The Art of Soaking Your Nuts. And we were talking all about how to lacto-ferment nuts, which we will get into later on. So simple oats. And this, honestly, this goes for any grain, seed, or nut. So for me, if I'm going to eat wheat flour, whether that's whole wheat or white flour, I will ferment it. I generally will do a sourdough. I'm not getting into sourdough today. That's a whole other topic. Rice I will soak before it, especially for folks who like want to enjoy eating brown rice, but they find it like a bit too hard or a bit too tough. If you soak it for 6 to 8 hours before you cook it, you're going to end up with a much softer and much more digestible food for you to eat there. Any beans, like we all kind of know the importance of, or the difficulties of digesting beans. They can give you a lot of gas, a lot of flatulence. And this is generally because folks don't ferment them or let them to soak before they cook them. Same thing goes for lentils. Same thing goes for like dried peas or chickpeas. Stuff that's in a can, it's already soaked. So you don't have to worry about that. You just rinse it off once you've taken it out. And then any of your nuts, whether they be almonds or peanuts or sunflower seeds or walnuts, I will soak them and then roast them the next day and generally keep them in the freezer to snack on as I wish. It's quite a few extra steps, but when we don't take these steps, we're not getting A, the amount of nutrition that we can, and then B, sometimes it's taking away the nutrition from our body because of those acids that are in the process. So that is kind of the simplest way to ferment your food to begin with, just an overnight soak. Now I'm going to get on to the very humble sauerkraut, and I'm going to share, I'm just going to put it in the chat here, my website, where you can find the recipe sheet for what I'm about to talk about. And as well, I will share my screen. So for the recording, we can have a look. It's www.welovenettles.ca/fermentation. So I will share this here. Here we go. Oop. So you'll come to, if you just type it in here at the top, fermentation, and then on the resources tab, it's in here. So I have already done this class online, and I actually have a recorded video for you here to watch if you're interested, as well as a little recipe sheet. And then I did an online question and answer on fermentation last year, which is up here, as well as a few pictures. So for now, we are looking at kind of the simple sauerkraut recipe right here. And I will read through the recipe, and then we're going to go through it live here. So for this particular ingredients, we are taking 1 medium cabbage, cored and shredded. I have 1 medium cabbage already done here for us. We also are taking a tablespoon of caraway seeds. Now, caraway are the traditional aromatic that is used. However, I really like to experiment every time. And today I am going to use, instead of caraway seeds, I'm using just a little bit of garlic and ginger to add a bit of flavor. You could try dill or coriander seeds or mustard seeds, whatever you have to hand, try it out. Just keep in mind not to put too much, because as it ferments, it really does get stronger in the flavor of the seeds. So keep in mind that less is often going to be a lot more after fermenting. Sea salt we have here, ideally it's non-iodized. If you want to get some iodine in your diet, then we just add a bit of seaweed to our sauerkraut, and that does the same thing. 4 tablespoons of whey, or an additional tablespoon of salt. So I'm not talking about whey today, which is something you get when you drain yogurt. It's the probiotic material there. So we're just going to stick with an extra tablespoon of salt here. So in a bowl, mix cabbage with caraway seeds, sea salt and whey, pound with a wooden pounder or a meat hammer for about 10 minutes to release the juices. Place in a liter-sized mason jar and press down firmly. The top of the cabbage should be at least 1 inch below the top of the jar. Cover lightly and keep at room temperature for 4 to 7 days before transferring to cold storage. It may be eaten immediately, but improves with age. Okay, so I may come back to that later, but what I want to do now, stop sharing, boop, turn my video back on. Great. Okay, so yeah, so let's go through this. That's the official recipe for you there, and now we're going to do it my way. So the idea about pounding it with a hammer is to start softening the cabbage and making it easier to work with. Now you have a few ways of doing this. You can pound it, or what I like to do, which is kind of a lazier method here. So this cabbage has already been mixed with the salt here. And what I did was I chopped this about 10, 11 o'clock this morning. So it's had a good 4 or 5 hours in this bowl. And generally what you do is you put a weight on top and you really give it a good mix. And you can't really see it here, but yeah. So at the bottom, there's quite a lot of water that's come out, which is a good sign. And then the feeling of the cabbage, it's already quite soft and quite moist. And the idea is that the salt is kind of doing the work of, instead of pounding it here, the salt starts drawing out by osmosis the water that's in the plant cells. It starts breaking it down for us, and it's kind of doing the job of just hitting it with a hammer. So if you got a bit of time before, letting it to just sit there. There are recipes that say that you got, like I had a housemate once, she's like, oh, I love sauerkraut, but it takes me so long to make. And I'm like, what are you doing? And she would sit here and massage, like put her hands through the sauerkraut and massage it for like a good 30 minutes to kind of get the same action going on. So honestly, like you can put it in a bowl, put a weight on top of it to kind of press it down and give it a few hours, or 10 minutes with a hammer, or half an hour mixing it, you all get the same process. Now I have here a good old-fashioned kimchi jar here. This is so I'm reusing for zero waste here, and I'm going to show you the process of kind of packing it in and adding our aromatics at the same time. So let's give this a go here. So I'm just going to fill this jar, and I have here some garlic, which I will roughly chop. Put it in here. Kind of like it pretty garlicky, so I'm adding a good, these are 4 or 5 cloves here. And ginger, probably not all of that ginger. So here we go. And I kind of like the getting crunchy chunks of ginger, so I'm going to leave this quite big, but if you're not a big fan of having lumps of ginger in your food, you can easily shred it as well, or put it in a food processor and do it that way. Now let's put this in here. So I'm curious, who thinks that we'll be able to get all of this cabbage in here? Like the next step is to push it down. And I have a feeling that it may not look like this looks like it's full, right? However, if we go to our close-up camera here, yes. So I can see here there's a lot of air gaps in here, and there's a lot of space, which is not what I want. Like Lactobacillus Bacteria is a anaerobic bacteria, which means that it can work without the presence of oxygen. So in here, there's still a lot of air in there. There's still a lot of space. So if I were to leave it like this, what would happen is other bacteria, which is aerobic, that we don't want in here, is going to use that oxygen, and it's going to start competing with the lactobacillus, and I might end up with bits of mold growing around here, which isn't what we want. So next, what we do is I generally use like another jar, and we are just going to start squishing it down. And this is really where, having left it for a few hours, or if you pound it with a meat hammer, you're going to be able to really get it in there a lot easier. So here, that's about 50% reduced already. And a little bit more. So, for those who may have never tasted sauerkraut, and I've taught this class quite a few times over the years, so I've had some comments and some questions that have surprised me, needless to say. But if you're starting from the very beginning, like this is a brand new process. So some things to keep in mind about your sauerkraut here. First one is cabbage is in the mustard family. It's a brassica. And what that means is it has organosulfuric compounds within it. And everyone kind of knows the smell of cabbage. It kind of smells a little bit like farts, for want of a better example. And so when your ferment is kind of doing its thing, and if you leave it in the bottom of your fridge, your housemate may open the fridge and be like, "What's that smell?" And it will be your sauerkraut. Don't worry about it. It is perfectly natural. It is really part of the process, especially in the first few days when the bacteria is really alive. It gives off carbon dioxide as it's doing its thing, and it will kind of whiff a little bit. So keep that in mind, that it's meant to smell. However, saying that, if it starts to smell bad, like putrid to you, or some other kind of bad, then this, you know, like with fermentation, you really trust your nose and your taste buds. And if it smells bad or tastes bad to you, then it probably has gone bad. If it just smells a little bit like cabbage that's been cooked for a long time, then that's exactly what it's meant to be like. Now let's see here. I'm nearly getting there. Some other things to keep in mind is what Lactobacillus Bacteria does is it breaks down sugars and turns them into acids. So this is going to get sour. It is called sauerkraut for a reason. I remember one time I got an email being like, Mark, I think my sauerkraut's gone wrong. It tasted good and tastes and sweet at the beginning, but as the days have gone on, it is now quite sour and acidic. I think I'm going to throw it out. And I had to pause for a moment and realize that I never explained that sauerkraut is meant to be sour. So this is another thing to keep in mind if you've never done it before. Now, as I'm pushing this in here, I can see, I'm going to show you the close-up camera again. Let me remove it here. So there is, as we squeeze it down here, you can see those bubbles coming out. There is the juice of the cabbage, which is slowly being pushed out as I squish it, and this is exactly what we want. The idea is that to have a good ferment and a healthy ferment, it needs to be under a layer of water. And I'm almost getting there. And what we can do is, let me remove this again. So I've given this a good squeeze. I have a handful of cabbage left for other things, which is good. Now, if my water level isn't high enough, luckily at the bottom of this bowl here, you can see that there's quite a lot of the liquid from the cabbage that was just sitting for a good few hours. So I'm going to pour that brine in here. Now, I've already salted this with 2 tablespoons of salt for kind of a medium-sized cabbage. Cabbage was about twice the size of this. This is certainly a small cabbage. For those who want a bit more precise lingo, when you get your vegetable, you want to do 2% of the weight of your vegetable. 2% of it is going to be the salt. So if you have a kilogram of cabbage, that means that you want 2 grams, is that right? 2 grams of salt? 1,000, no, it's 20 grams of salt, okay? So 20 grams of salt per kilo of vegetable. And if we're adding water to it, which we will with some of the other things, it's the vegetable and the water needs to be taken into account to calculate that 2%. So I'll talk about that again a little bit later. But for now, we're pretty good. So here, I'm just topping it up, and my sauerkraut is looking pretty good. So we can see at the top here that there's still not enough water. So what we can do, I have plain water here, which we can just add to top it up. However, being a herbalist, I always like to sneak in herbs, and I have some sage tea here. And so instead of just adding plain water, I am going to add a nice sage flavor to my sauerkraut. So right there, now I can see, and I'll put you in the close-up again. So here, let's just go up a bit more. So now you can see that there is a clear level of tea and saltwater solution that is covering the top of my sauerkraut there. And this ensures that everything kind of stays in that anaerobic environment and ferments well. Now, some things to think about here. I'm going to put the lid on, but I am not going to put it on super tight. Some things that are going to happen here. The first thing is it's going to create gas. So if I keep a super tight lid on there, it may explode. You may have, especially with kombucha, if anyone's tried making kombucha, that can really, you can end up with a kombucha nade where glass just goes everywhere. Take it from me. So we want to leave this finger tight in order for it to breathe. And the second thing that may happen, especially if you didn't let your cabbage sit for a while with the salt, is the water level in here will rise. Like as the salt starts pulling out the water from the cabbage, it's basically like wringing out a sponge, and the water level will rise to the point where it may overfill your jar and flow normally down the back of your fridge is where I like to keep my ferments. So take it from me, to keep a freshly made sauerkraut in some kind of bowl or receptacle that will catch the water. This bowl's a little bit too small, but it's what I have right here just for demonstration purposes. The idea being that if it does overflow, you get to keep the brine solution in here and you don't end up with stinky cabbage juice all over your kitchen surface when you come home from a day of work and see what's going on. So this right here is your very simple and humble sauerkraut. Does anybody have any questions for me so far? Kind of the next step here is to let it ferment at room temperature for the next 4 to 7 days. And what I recommend is that every day, take the lid off, have a smell, have a taste, and also give it a poke. So poke it down and make sure that everything kind of stays as submerged as possible under the brine solution. If like you see that let's say this is my brine solution and the cabbage kind of pokes up, you can use weights to keep it down. You can take a good rock that you've kind of boiled clean and you can put that down there to raise it. Something else you can do is you can put a jar in there and just push it down, and then that will raise the liquid level there. And you can screw the lid on with a smaller jar. Or another thing you can do, take a plastic Ziploc bag, put some salt water in there in case it pops and leaks, and then you put the plastic bag on top of your sauerkraut and it acts as a weight. And that way it will keep the cabbage submerged and your sauerkraut nice and healthy. So room temperature is perfectly good. In the winter, your sauerkraut is going to ferment slower than it will do in the summer. Kind of 21 degrees to 28 degrees is the perfect temperature for ferments. The hotter it is, the faster it will be. And really, it is up to you in terms of when you think it's ready to put in the fridge. Like if you like really sour things, which I'm a big fan of, then you may want to leave it out for more like 7 days. If you like kind of that mix between sweet and sour, 3 days is probably where you want to go. But every day you're going to take it out and have a little taste. Right now, it's super sweet. That's all the starches are still very much starch here in the cabbage. And then in 2 to 3 days, it's going to start getting that sour tang. And then in 5 to 6, it's going to be really nice and sour. So that is your sauerkraut. Now, moving on, put this over here. Let's talk about other kinds of vegetables that we can do. So I got a bigger jar here. Now, the beauty of fermentation, once you learn the standards, and some things to look out for with any fermentation: does it smell bad? Does it look bad? Is there mold growing on top? Now, there is such a thing known as cam yeast, K-A-H-M. Cam yeast is kind of a thin layer of white, kind of speckly mold that may grow on top of your fermentation. It is not a reason to throw it out. You can often, like let's say I went on vacation for 2 months and I come back, there will probably be quite a thick layer of white mold on top of this ferment here. As long as it's white, and only white, I can scoop off the layers that are covered in the mold, throw them away in the compost, and then add more salt water to it, and I can continue, as long as it tastes good to me, I can continue to eat the fermented food underneath. If it's blue mold or red mold or brown mold, you don't want to touch your ferment. If it's just white, especially if it's cam yeast, then you've got no problem. Go ahead, scoop it off, maybe change the water a little bit, and then you've got yourself a safe to eat ferment nonetheless. So yes, the beauty of fermentation. Once you've learned how to do a sauerkraut, that's where everybody should start. You kind of realize that every fruit, vegetable, and even getting into meats as well, if you want to, can be fermented. So with fruit, for example, especially soft fruit, it's not going to hold its integrity. So let's say if I want to ferment blueberries, remember how I was talking about the layer of the pale lactobacillus? It's called the bloom. The bloom you can easily see on blueberries, right? And if I was to ferment those, they would turn into a mushy paste. Not the tastiest to kind of try and eat on its own, but if you put that in the fridge, you can use that as kind of a sweet, savory topping for ice cream or yogurt. I've seen people make like a lot of sauces and glazes out of fermented fruit. So, and this is especially going zero waste here. If you have like a whole bunch, let's say you're making a pineapple and you have a whole bunch of little pineapple cuttings left over that you can't really do much with, or you're chopping up strawberries and you've got all these bunch of little bits of strawberries, you can throw them into a jar, make your saltwater solution, and let them ferment, and then blend them up, and then you've got yourself kind of a sweet, salty, sour sauce that you could use as maybe a pizza topping or a glaze in your cooking there, or something to put on top of your yogurt. You can really experiment as much as you like. Now here, what I'm working with are good old-fashioned carrots. So these were kicking around in my fridge. They're a bit soft now, but you can't bring back from the dead like rotting vegetables. So as long as they're in a good shape, which these still are, these are still perfectly edible, I'm going to use these. So something to keep in mind, like especially with other things, like, is there the lactobacillus on carrots? I don't think so. So what do we do here? If I just put salt water in here and let it ferment, maybe another bacteria would move in because there's no starting bacteria. So what I do is I go back to my original cabbage, and I'm just going to take a handful of cabbage here that I had from my sauerkraut left over, put it in there, and now I've added the Lactobacillus bacteria. So I can then go ahead and add my water. And for this, so what the stage would be now to get your 2%, I would have weighed my jar at the beginning, and then I want the total weight of the water and the vegetable, and then I make a 2% salt solution that's equivalent to the weight of the vegetable and the water. I hope I'm clear for everybody there. So it's the water and the vegetable matter together that we need to weigh in order to get that 2% solution. However, I just like to go by taste. So I'm going to start with, and it is, so if you over salt, like sauerkraut shouldn't be so salty that it's hard to eat. It should be pleasantly salty. If you over salt your sauerkraut, it's not the end of the world. All you'll need to do is kind of drain the brine, add more fresh water, and then taste it again and see kind of what happens. I've had some really salty things where I've even taken them out of the jar and washed them under the tap and then eaten them. They become a lot more palatable that way. So it's better to start with less salt than more. So that's a tablespoon of salt there, and I'm just going to mix this around, let it dissolve and do its thing, and I'll come back to this in a little while. Oh, that was interesting. So I'm going to come back to this in a little while here and taste that and kind of see whether the salt level is where we want it to be. Now, let's go back to our sunflower seeds. So this is kind of soaking your nuts 2.0. So here, these, if I just wanted to eat these normally, I would drain them tomorrow and put them in a pan and lightly toast them until they turn brown and enjoy them as I would normally. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to teach you how to do a lacto-ferment of sunflower seeds. So what this means is that I need Lactobacillus bacteria. So in it goes a little pinch of cabbage. Keep in mind that seeds may swell as well, so this may overflow with water. Now what I'm going to do, instead of leaving this for 1 day, I am going to let this ferment together for probably 3 to 5 days. And when this starts to smell really sour, like I'm talking like pickle sour, then I know it's ready. And what I'll do is I'll drain it, I'll take the cabbage out, drain it, put it in the oven and roast it. And what will happen then is, instead of kind of a somewhat, bland sunflower seed, I have now got a sour sunflower seed that has been lacto-fermented. And the best way I can describe this is it's almost like a Parmesan kind of flavor to it. There's a little bit of umami. There's quite a cheese-like flavor to it. I call them my cheesy nuts for those friends of mine who've had the pleasure of tasting them. And then you can really just grind this, mix it with, once it's dry, mix it with a pinch of salt, and then you can enjoy it as a vegan Parmesan if you wish. So this right here is how we lacto-ferment nuts. It's a little bit trickier. You'll have to really keep an eye on the cam yeast. I remember when I've done this before that at times I've seen the white cam yeast growing on here. So kind of scoop things out and I've replaced the brine. So drain the brine, put it in, added fresh salt, and I will actually add more salt to this because I only added a pinch of salt before. Now, if I'm going to do a lacto ferment for 4 or 5 days, I need quite a bit more salt. So that's like half a tablespoon in there, and I will again taste that at the end and see if it needs more. So the last thing I am going to teach you how to do is pickled eggs, or lacto-fermented eggs. So I have here some hard-boiled eggs. So we probably, like in England, they're a big thing to have them behind a bar as a great snack food. There'll be eggs in vinegar that are pickled. And as I was explaining earlier, these have traditionally always been fermented. So I'm going to show you now how to do a lacto-fermented hard-boiled egg. So these were hard-boiled earlier. Poke them in there. I will add... Now this is what I wanted to use. I kind of like the idea of having pink eggs. So I am going to use a red cabbage this time. And the idea being that eventually the color of the cabbage hopefully is going to transform these eggs into light pink when they're ready. So just getting like a leaf or two. I'm going to roughly just tear that up and put it in my jar here. And you can see from the previous sauerkraut that it can make a beautiful color here. So this is kind of what I'm aiming for. And putting this in here. And this, by doing this, I'm adding my lactobacillus. And then I think, again, I'm going to try a bit of water and then a bit of sage as well. A bit of water, a bit of sage, and I have some other seasoning here as well I want to try. So I have some ground chipotle chili here from Mexico. So I'm going to make these kind of spicy pickled eggs here. So a little bit of that, and I'm going to add some ginger in here as well. Why not? Let's make this like a kind of a peppery, spicy pickled egg. And I will share photos of this on my website page when they are ready. And so with eggs, they are good to eat again within about 3 to 7 days. And I've heard people say that you should eat them within 2 weeks. I had one, I did this for a workshop, and then I forgot about one. It was in the back of my fridge for like a month. It was really tasty. So, it looked good, it smelled good. There was nothing moldy growing on it. So I just went ahead and enjoyed it, and it was pretty great. So I'll do a little close up here of what the eggs look like here. So they're in there doing their thing. You can see the chili getting in there. And oh, I forgot to add the salt. That's pretty important step there. So I will go ahead, just add close to a tablespoon of salt here. And that's that there. So I will show the carrots here as well. Now, something to keep in mind, like I remember trying carrots one time before and I shredded them. And then I tried doing a ferment then. And basically what happened was they got way too mushy. And I think because the surface area of shredded carrots is much greater than just these nice chunky ones. And so like, it wasn't very palatable to eat. It would have been good as like a soup stock or a salad dressing additive or something like that, but it just wasn't so good by itself. So here, I'm just gonna taste. Yeah, so it's a good amount of salt there. Like I don't have to add too much more to that. And I will be checking up on these every day, kind of giving them a little shake as well. And then once they're sour enough, I will put them in the fridge and enjoy them that way. So I think we've got our sunflowers, we've got our pickled eggs doing their thing, we've got our sauerkraut over here. Are there any questions? Yes, there are. For the cabbage, we wash it carefully to not take away the bacteria, or would it be better to simply remove the first few leaves and not wash the other ones? Good question. So yes, as long as you rinse it and you don't scrub it, the lactobacillus isn't going to go anywhere. You think about the rain, it's going to keep it, it's going to stay on the cabbage. I always like to use, like I don't have the money to afford organic produce all the time, but when I am fermenting stuff, I do like to buy organic, just the idea that you're really getting everything you can out of the plant. So that could include any of the chemicals that were used in making it. So keeping it organic is one thing I would highly recommend for this. And yeah, peeling away the outer layers, rinsing it under the tap is more than enough for what you need to do to clean this cabbage. And the core of the cabbage, like the very center, isn't something that we generally ferment either. I would throw that in the freezer and use it in a soup stock because it's just a bit too fibrous to eat. Good question. Does anybody have any other questions for me at this moment in time? Oh, yes. I did forget one thing. So I'll wait and see if anyone adds anything. So I have here, as a forager and a herbalist, I always love to add some wild foods. And so I have here a local branch of pine and a piece of cedar. And neither of these are poisonous, first of all, but they're not necessarily edible. Like you can't just munch on this. And even if it was fermented, it's still very fibrous, it's very waxy. However, there's a lot of good flavors and nutrients in here that we can access. So what I'm gonna do here with the carrots, I'm going to add a sprig of cedar just in my ferment here. And then essentially, when it comes for it to be ready, I will just take the cedar out and eat the carrots. And now we are going to end up with a cedar carrot Lacto-Ferment. So this is a great way you can kind of get to know your neighborhood plants. If I had remembered that about the pine, I would have probably put my pine in first and then packed the sauerkraut around that, but that's okay. I'll do that for next time. So yes, and using some wild foods really gives us an opportunity to access kind of nutrients and flavor profiles that we don't normally have. Some other great wild foods to add are seaweeds, go super well in ferments. They're very nutritious They're great wild foods and they're easily accessible as items of commerce. Cedar, juniper, any of the pine species. There's only one evergreen which is poisonous, and that's the yew tree. So I recommend you learn how to identify what yew looks like. If you don't know, just have a nibble on the needles, and if it doesn't taste like pine, then it's a yew tree. Like the yew needles are bitter and very disgusting and somewhat poisonous, but nibbling on them, you're not going to harm yourself. And so using the pines, we really get the antibacterial components and a lot of vitamin C in the bud as well. And for those who are interested in learning more, I'm going to be teaching a workshop at the end of the month on winter plant identification with Vanier College. If you're interested in learning about that, you can find me on my website and send me a message and I'll send you the link. It's another free workshop that I'm doing here. It has indeed been a pleasure, because my very first class on fermentation I took at the Concordia greenhouse with Sheena a good 4 or 5 years ago. So it is very much a pleasure coming back to the Student Union and offering another workshop. A few more questions here. What about more fruity fermentations? Pineapple for tepache, is it the same principles? Pretty much, yes. Tepache, I have a few Mexican friends that make it. I don't think you add salt to tepache, but it's pretty much the same principles. Like, and instead of adding like a cabbage to it, you can add like a teaspoon of just your good old-fashioned baker's yeast, and you can make yourself like an alcoholic drink that way. And some other fun things that I've tried fermenting that I highly recommend are potatoes. So you cut your potatoes into cubes, ferment them in a lacto brine like this. Then when they start getting a little bit soft in like 3 or 4 days, you drain them, you pat them dry, you roast them in the oven, and then you end up with a half pickle, half potato dish, which is really, really interesting. I found the recipe, someone was looking for like a more healthier French fry, and so lacto-fermenting the potato beforehand, it's apparently less reactive with the oil, so there's less oxidation. It means that it's more healthy for us. So that's something you can try. I've also done it with butternut squash and with turnips. I've yet to move into meats. This is an introductory class to fermentation, right? This book here is the Noma Guide to Fermentation. This book has some really advanced things in here. It teaches you how to make garum and shoyu, which is basically, it's soya sauce, but instead of using wheat or barley as the ferment, you can use beef or fish or shellfish or chicken, and you basically make a meaty soya sauce with a ferment of koji, which is a whole other level. And then there's like, you can look into fermenting things like salami, where you take sausages, you roll it in koji spores, and then you ferment it that way. But that is honestly another level, and I'm only just getting there myself. Tepache is done with the dark sugar. That's the solid, like brick-like sugar, I believe, that you just kind of shave off, and then you add that. Something to think about. You may be thinking like, oh, I want to do a sweet ferment with fruit in it. I'm going to add sugar at the beginning. Keep in mind that the sugar you add at the beginning of your ferment will not give you a sweet end product. The lactobacillus or any other yeast or bacteria is going to eat that sugar and turn it into alcohol and acids. So if you want a sweet ferment, you need to add your sugar at the end. If you want a boozy, stronger ferment, you add your sugar at the beginning. It's something to keep in mind. And there is not salt, great. It's just pineapple peel, the dark brown sugar, and some spices. There you go. Thank you very much for that, Soraya. Some other interesting ferments, let me think here. Sourdough is, of course, like a whole science in itself. Maybe next time we can do a sourdough class, like that is really, it's a mix of art and science with sourdough. It really is a nice, enjoyable experience. You can ferment mushrooms. However, it's important to kind of pre-cook them, like lightly steam them at least, before you start fermenting them, because the chitin in there in the mushroom doesn't easily break down otherwise, and you can give yourself indigestion. It's kind of eating a raw mushroom, which isn't so good for you. Let's see here. Any other final comments? I'll just check over my notes. Ah, yes, I didn't talk about pickles yet. Okay, so essentially with this carrot ferment here, if I were to do exactly the same thing, but instead of adding carrots, I add cucumbers, like garden Macklemore cucumbers, you will end up with a pickle. Now, something to keep in mind is, I remember the first time I tried doing this, it looked good, it smelled good, it tasted good, and the moment I cut it open, it was pretty mushy inside. So the idea is like the salt kind of pulls out the moisture in the cucumber, and then it leads to it start degrading on the inside. So the way that we prevent that, commercial, you can buy, I think it's calcium chloride. You would have to, if you look on the back of your commercial pickles, there is a mineral that is added that kind of keeps the crunch and keeps it firm in your pickle. Now, for those who don't want to do that, the other good news is we can add plants that are astringent to keep the pickles nice and crunchy. And what I did with quite a lot of good success was oak leaves. So everyone knows oak, I hope. It's the plant that grows acorns, the tree that grows acorns. And a handful of the fresh leaves from the tree, I think I added about half a dozen, and I would add the same to these. They are filled with a lot of the tannic acid that has the same astringent properties that the mineral that they add to your commercial pickles does. So by adding that into my ferment, I was able to make a crunchy pickle with much success. And it was a probiotic pickle nonetheless. And I think that's about it from me. If there's not any more final questions, then I wish you all success in your future fermenting endeavors. I will post pictures of what the eggs end up looking like and the rest of these as well. And thank you all for being here. Thank you for the Student Union for inviting me. And I wish everybody to have an enjoyable afternoon with their newfound fermentation knowledge. Okay.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.